Hey my friends, this is a full detailed guide to the 9 different world buffs in WoW Classic Hardcore or really any Classic era server, and this is for both lower leveling characters and endgame dungeon or raiding players. I'll talk through what each buff is, how they're dropped or initiated, where to be and how to get them, and if you're a raider, how to get them in the optimal order to maximize their length and store them with a Chronoboon, and even how to get through Dire Maul safely. So if you're someone that's played forever or you're in a raiding guild already, you're likely going to know all of this. This is for folks that might be new to hardcore or it's been a while and you just want a refresher. Also, since I'm showing this on a hardcore realm, which is of course PvE, getting this stuff on an era PvP server with the potential for PvP or buff purging is a whole separate issue. And I'll do my best to cover this from both the Horde and Alliance perspective, but I'll angle slightly toward Alliance, which is where I play. So first we'll go through the 2 main buffs that you can and should get at any level, and potentially a third to help with your leveling, and then I'll talk through the rest of the buffs you should get if you're a level 60 raider or potentially even a 60 doing dungeon. So when you're on hardcore and you see this constant spam in the looking for group channel, people are saying when buffs or summon to BB for buffs at 250, what they're referring to are the 2 primary buffs that any player can get, and they're extremely helpful for any class and any level and are 100% required for endgame raiding. The first is Spirit of Zandalar. This buff gives you 10% additional run speed and 15% increase to all stats, so more health, more mana, more regen, and all the other benefits that stats gives you, and you run faster, which is absolutely huge for leveling. You get this buff if you're in Booty Bay or on Yojamba Island when someone completes the quest Heart of Hakar, which you do by killing the last boss in Zul'Gurub with 20 players. One player loots the heart and turns it into Mothro on Yojamba Island here in STV. That player gets to choose one of 3 trinkets, and then anyone in those areas gets the buff. So most raiders in the group that actually is turning in the heart will meet at Yojamba Island for the turn-in. Most other players will meet in Booty Bay. So to start, if you're a leveling player, you need to know when buffs are going to happen and then get yourself to Booty Bay. Usually your realm will have a realm or server Discord group with a channel where people can list when world buffs are going out, and potentially the larger guilds on your server might have their own public channel where they list when their drops are going to happen. You can also just keep your eye on the looking for group channel, and when buffs are going to happen, people will be talking about it constantly, and as it gets closer, you'll see warlocks offering summons to Booty Bay for buffs at this time, and then you'll know exactly when it's going to happen. And incidentally, you don't need to spam everyone in the looking for group channel of when buffs the second you log in or every 30 seconds. Just be patient, watch the channel, check the discords, and you'll figure it out. Next, get yourself to Booty Bay. If you're Horde, this is super easy. You take a boat from Ratchet. If you're Alliance, it's a bit more challenging for the first time. If you're under, say, level 30, the run through Duskwood and south through STV can be a challenge. There are ways to swim from Westfall along the coast safely down, but that can take a long time. The best way is to get a summon from a warlock. On Defias Pillager, my server, a number of warlocks will be selling summons to Booty Bay for around 1 gold. If you're on hardcore and playing self-found, you should either be in a full self-found guild that has warlocks dedicated to summoning you for free, or you should pay that summoning warlock on a non-self-found character. There's nothing worse than self-found players that beg warlocks for free summons to Booty Bay. It's just not cool, and you've got to give them something for farming shards and getting you down there. So you've made it to Booty Bay. If it's the first time, make sure you get the flight path so you can fly next time, and I recommend setting your hearth to Booty Bay. Incidentally, if you're using the DBM add-on, you'll get a notice when the quest is first turned in for a full 50 seconds prior to the buff dropping, which gives you plenty of time to hearth right then and get the buff. Last, once you're in Booty Bay, you want to be grouped with a mage or a mage yourself so that you can get a portal to Stormwind or Orgrimmar the second you get that buff. Be sure you actually see the buff icon appear on your character before you click the portal. So now you're in Stormwind to get the second buff, Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer. This buff gives you plus 10% spell crit, plus 5% melee and ranged crit, and 140 additional attack power. So it's absolutely huge, yet again, for leveling and mandatory for raiding. You get this buff when someone turns in either the head of Onyxia or the head of Nefarian, which they got in a 40-man raid of either Onyxia's lair or Blackwing lair. When the dragon dies, one player loots the head and turns it into one of 2 NPCs at the front of either Stormwind or Orgrimmar. And incidentally, the player turning in the Onyxia's head gets to choose between a trinket, ring, and neck. And when you turn in the head of Nefarian, you get to choose between this neck, offhand, or ring. And just for awareness, when raiding guilds kill these, either Hakar or Onyxia or Nefarian, they're giving that turn-in item to a player that is intentionally holding on to that item until a time when the raid or guild leader specifies so they can be dropped to buff that next raid. You'll also notice that the heart and heads are dropped very close to each other, usually within 2 minutes, because once the first buff is dropped, the clock is ticking on those 2-hour buffs the moment that first buff goes out. Now, 1 week per month, all players can get a third world buff, Darkmoon Faire or Sage's Dark Fortune. The Darkmoon Faire starts every first Monday of the month and leaves exactly 1 week later, and it rotates between Elwyn Forest south of Goldshire and Mulgore south of Thunderbluff. You can see the exact calendar here on Wowhead. So if the fair is going on in your city, once you get Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer, you can run down south to the fair, speak with Sage, who will ask you 2 questions and then give you a 2-hour buff depending on the answer to those multiple choice questions. You'll nearly always want to simply select the first answer to both questions for the 10% increased damage buff, but there are other options shown here. If you're a leveling character and the buff is not near your city, you're likely going to skip it. If you're a raider, you'll need to plan to get it separately and likely sort with a Chronoboon, like I'll explain in a moment. Alright, so normally as a leveler, you're now done and should head out into the world and quest or grind mobs. Now is the time to go level. Don't get buffs and then sit in the city working on professions, because again, the clock is ticking. Also, you can log off and that stops the timer on your buffs. You then have 2 hours of in-game playtime with these buffs. So those are the 3 buffs that will help if you're leveling. If you're a 60 raider or you really want to make dungeons easier and safer, here's how to get everything else in the order I take to optimize them. And you're going to want to bring at least one and probably multiple Chronoboon displacers, which you can buy from Chromie in Western Plaguelands around Anderhall for 10 gold after completing the quest A Matter of Time. These can also be sold on the auction house for a slight markup. A Chronoboon is an item that you can click that will store any of the buffs I cover here except for the very last one and make it so that the timer on that buff is stopped and the benefit of the buff is temporarily removed from your character. Once you've stored the buffs, you get a supercharged Chronoboon displacer in your inventory that you can later click to restore the buffs and restart the timer and of course re-enable the benefits. There is some nuance to the way this works. For instance, if you store 1 or 2 of the buffs, then go get a different buff, that new buff will be ticking on your character and not stored in the Chronoboon with the first 2. You could then restore your stored buffs, and then both the buffs you had originally stored and the new buff you'd gotten most recently would all be active. You can then click another Chronoboon and store them all. The caveat to that is that there's a 1-hour cooldown on using the Chronoboon to store buffs. So for example, you couldn't store your 3 Dire Maul buffs, then instantly run to get a Songflower buff, unboon and reboon right away, because your Chronoboon would be on cooldown from when you were in Dire Maul. You would have to wait 1 hour, and you can be logged off for this, before storing another set. So it's a bit complex, but I hope that's clear. Okay, so you have your Chronoboons and we'll start at Dire Maul North in Feralus. You can skip running through these ogres all the way to the instance in North Dire Maul as a level 60. I'll show that full run inside and out at the end of this video, but I'll hit on the key stuff now. You'll need a cleared Dire Maul tribute run where a group has gone in, skipped certain bosses, cleared certain hostile mobs, and then fooled Cromcrush at the end using the ogre suit. Once that's done, the ogres in the instance become friendly and the group can talk to Mizzle here at the end and get a buff that makes them the King of Gordok, and then able to talk to the 3 bosses that were skipped, each of whom give you a different buff. Moldar gives plus 15 stam, Fengus gives 200 attack power, and Slipkick gives 3% spell crit. Now when you're running through the instance, it's not perfectly safe and it's easy to screw up the instance for yourself or others. And this is coming from the expert in this area. I've griefed my poor guild in every way possible in Dire Maul. So when you're running through, you want to stay away from any hostile mobs. You could check if they're hostile by hovering your cursor over them. And if it remains the hand, they're not hostile. If it turns into the sword, they're hostile and you need to stay away. At the beginning, all of the bugs will always be hostile. Gartfengus may be patrolling around and will be hostile. In the packs of ogres and demons, the demons will be hostile, and most importantly, there periodically will be patrolling green eyes called Wandering Eye of Kilrog that must be instantly killed or they'll summon Voidwalker demons. If that happens, you get this pack of dangerous mobs and either a group needs to come back in and kill them or your instance is ruined. So when I'm running through, I'm checking every pack with my cursor. I'm looking for Fengus to see where he is, and incidentally, the other way I've griefed an instance is by speaking to Fengus in the wrong spot once I had my king buff. When you speak to him and get buffed, he freezes in the spot for a time, and then he'll start to pad around again. And of course, he's friendly to you because you have the king buff, but somebody coming into the instance new to get buffs does not have it and he will be hostile. So usually if he's padding, you want to talk to him right in the center of this courtyard here, so new players can easily get around him. I've talked to him right in this hallway entrance, which just completely screws over anyone else coming in, so be very careful with that. And also, while running in, I'm spamming a macro to target and mark the Wandering Eyes because I will Fire Blast or do whatever is necessary to kill them quickly. You make your run here, get the king buff, speak with 3 bosses and get your buffs. Also, the DMT clearing groups can carefully skip the eyes, leaving them alive until the end of the run when they become the Ogre King, and if they do that, the eyes will be non-hostile even to new players entering the run, which is the absolute safest situation, but it's pretty uncommon because I think it's hard to skip those eyes. Most groups will have to kill the eyes on their way in clearing. The next step is Songflower and Felwood. Now your 3 Dire Maul buffs are ticking, so at this stage you can either move quick or burn 1 Chronoboon to save those 3 buffs. Either way, you want to get to Felwood next. Ideally, you'd have a mage port you from Dire Maul to Darnassus and fly to Felwood. The northern camp here if you're Alliance, or down near the Emerald Sanctuary if you're Horde. From there, you need to have brought with you a Cenarian plant salve, which you get after completing the quest Cleansing Felwood from Erethandris in the south here, and then obtaining shards either from killing or skinning or mining or other things in Felwood, which you would then turn into him to get the salves. You take your salve to a corrupted Songflower, click it to cleanse it, and then click the flower to get a 5% crit and 15% stats for an hour buff. So the catch here is that all the flowers can only be cleansed every 25 minutes. So if you have the Nova World Buffs add-on, it will show you the flower locations and their remaining times. If you're maximizing your time and you didn't Chronoboon your Dire Maul buffs, it's best to get to the closest flower, note how long it has left, log out and log back in with say 30 seconds or so before it becomes available. Also, if there's others near the flower, you can share it, but everyone has to have clicked the cleansed flower within a very, very short time of each other. So usually everyone will just spam click it and get the buff. From there, I recommend instantly hearthing to Booty Bay. Again, if you're maximizing your time or the primary buffs aren't being dropped for a while, you can store your Songflower in a Chronoboon. If not, I will then get to Booty Bay, log off and play an alt, or wait until I know the 2 standard buffs are going to go out, and then I will try to log back in the moment Spirit of Zandalar is going to drop. Pick that up, get a quick portal to Stormwind or Orgrimmar for Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer, and I will normally Chronoboon right then. If it's Darkmoon Fair week and it's close like this, you'd run down south to the fair and grab Sage's buff, then Chronoboon. If it's DMF week and it's at the farther location, you're going to be using multiple Chronoboons to save that buff separately, get all the others, then unboon and reboon with all of them. Again, Chronoboon will save any buffs I've just mentioned, the Dragon, ZG buffs, Dire Maul buffs, Felwood Songflower, and the Darkmoon Fair buffs. But you have to manage saving the buffs within that 1 hour cooldown constraint on rebooning buffs. Last thing I'll mention about Sage's Dark Fortune or the DMF buff is that you can only get this every 4 hours. And that's 4 hours from the last time it was made active on your character. This means if you get the buff and let's say let it tick down for 30 minutes, then Chronoboon it for 2 more days, then unchronoboon it. You've just started that 4-hour timer at the exact moment you unchronobooned. If you were to re-chronoboon with only 2 minutes left on the buff, for example, you would restart that full 4-hour timer when you unchronobooned it the next time. So you need to keep that in mind if you're looking to manage picking this up multiple times. So next up is Warchief's Blessing. This is largely an exclusively Horde and exclusively melee buff, although on Hardcore an extra 300 hit points for casters or anyone else is going to be really nice. You get this if you're in Orgrimmar or the Crossroads when someone turns in the head of Ren Blackhand in Orgrimmar. Now it's possible to get this as Alliance by being mind controlled during a duel by a Horde priest or a Horde player with a gnomish mind control cap just as the buff goes out. The Melee and Alliance hardcore guilds will have mind control players ready and will organize with Horde players to do this before bigger raids, but of course that involves quite a bit of planning. It's worth mentioning that there's a dedicated Alliance version of this called Might of Stormwind, which you get if the Alliance loots the head and turns it in Stormwind, but this was only active for a single week in July of 2024 when a bunch of stuff related to Season of Discovery was mistakenly rolled out to Era servers and then later reversed, so I'm not including it in our list here. And the last world buff is Fire Resist. Again, I think this is probably hardcore or maybe speedrun specific, but for my guild, prior to running BWL or MC, you'll log into Blackrock Spire, and just inside are level 54 or 55 mobs called Scar Shield Spellbinders, and they can be mind controlled by priests, and then can cast a huge plus 83 Fire Resist buff on themselves or any party member. So we'll get our entire 40-man raid team to line up at Blackrock Spire, and then take turns zoning in to get this buff. And I believe rogues or other classes can solo this using the gnomish mind control cap also, but it's better to group with priests in a group and get the buff. Okay, here's the quick version of getting all the buffs in the order I prefer. Get yourself to Dire Maul North and either participate in a Dire Maul tribute run or leech into a cleared instance. Run through checking all the packs of mobs with your cursor. The hand means not hostile and the sword means hostile. Avoid guard Fangus and constantly look for Wandering Eyes of Kilrog that must be instantly killed. Talk to Mizzle at the end to get the king buff. Run back and talk to Slipkick to get the spell crit buff, Fangus to get the AP buff, and Moldar to get the stam buff. Get a mage port or otherwise get yourself to Darnassus and fly to Felwood. Cleanse a corrupted flower to get the Songflower buff. Immediately hearth to Booty Bay and wait for the Spirit of Zandalar buff. Take a mage port to Stormwind or Orgrimmar and get the Dragon Slayer buff. If it's DMF week and it's local, run south out of your city to the fair. Talk to Sage and select answer 1 to both of his questions, getting the 10% DMF buff. If it's not local, you need to get this separately and store it with a Chronoboon. If you're a Horde player, return to Orgrimmar for the Rend Head drop for War Chief's Blessing. If you're Alliance, you'll need to arrange a Horde partner to mind control you, either as a priest or with the Gnomish mind control cap before the buff goes out. And finally, if you're doing Molten Core or Blackwing Lair, get yourself to Blackrock Spire and just inside have a priest mind control the Scarshield Spellbinder to cast plus 83 fire resistance on you. And reminder, you can store any of these except for fire resistance inside a Chronoboon and restore them later, but you can only activate or start the storage once per hour, and each time costs a 10 gold consumable. And that is the 9 world buffs and how to get them. Here's a full run to and through Dire Maul getting those buffs. If this was helpful at all and you don't mind clicking that like or sub button, I really appreciate it. Thanks for watching, folks.